In today's lesson, we will be learning advanced vocabulary from Reuters news. Let's look at the headline. U.S. Army Secretary Driscoll meets Russian delegation in Abu Dhabi, official says. Let's look at the first paragraph. U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll held talks with Russian officials in Abu Dhabi on Monday, the latest effort by President Donald Trump's administration to broker a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. Let's look at the first word in our lesson, held. Held is a verb. Held is the past simple and past participle of hold. Held is used to describe when an important meeting or discussion took place between parties. The article says, U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll held talks with Russian officials in Abu Dhabi on Monday. According to the article, U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll had discussions with Russian officials in Abu Dhabi on Monday. Let's practice with held. The school held a meeting with Sarah's mother. Our manager held a meeting at the office. Let's look at the second word in our lesson, broker. Broker is a verb. To broker means to arrange or negotiate a deal or agreement. The article says the latest effort by President Donald Trump's administration to broker a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. The article indicates that Trump's administration is trying to negotiate a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. Let's practice with broker. The real estate agent brokered the sale of the office between two companies. The diplomat brokered a ceasefire between the two conflicting nations. Let's look at the second paragraph. The meeting comes after U.S. and Ukrainian officials sought to narrow the gaps between them over a plan to end the war in Ukraine, agreeing to modify a U.S. proposal that Kyiv and its European allies saw as a Kremlin wish list. Let's look at the third word in our lesson, thought. Sought is a verb and it is the past simple of seek. Sought means looked for, tried to get, or tried to achieve. The article says the meeting comes after the U.S. and Ukrainian officials sought to narrow the gaps between them over a plan to end the war in Ukraine. The article states that the U.S. and Ukraine officials tried to reduce the differences between them on how to end the war in Ukraine. Let's practice with sought. She sought help from her teacher to understand the maths problem. They sought a house near the city center. Let's look at the fourth word in our lesson, modify. Modify is a verb. To modify means to change something such as a plan, opinion, law, or a way of behaving. The article says agreeing to modify a U.S. proposal that Kyiv and its European allies saw as a Kremlin wish list. According to the article, the negotiators agreed to change the U.S. proposal because Ukraine and their European allies believed that the original plan or proposal favored Russia. Let's practice with modify. The marketing team modified the product design after receiving customer complaints. He had to modify his eating habits since he was falling sick too often. Let's look at the third paragraph in our lesson. U.S. policy toward the war in Ukraine has zigzagged in recent months. Trump's hastily arranged Alaska summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in August spurred worries Washington might accept many Russian demands, but ultimately resulted in more U.S. pressure on Russia. Let's look at the fifth word in our lesson, zigzagged. Zigzagged is the past of zigzag. Zigzag refers to a situation in which actions, plans, or ideas change suddenly. The article says, U.S. policy toward the war in Ukraine has zigzagged in recent months. The article highlights that the U.S. policy has changed direction many times when it comes to Russia's war on Ukraine in the past few months. Let's practice with zigzagged. The new mayor has zigzagged in his plans for the city. The governor's approach to education zigzags between strict and flexible rules. Let's move on now to the sixth word in our lesson, hastily. Hastily is an adverb. Hastily means something is done very quickly and without enough thought or care. The article says, Trump's hastily arranged Alaska summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in August. The article suggests that Trump quickly arranged a meeting with Russian President Putin and did not give much thought or deliberation on the overall end goal, peace for Ukraine. Let's practice with hastily. The report was written hastily and had many errors. She packed her bag hastily and forgot her wallet. Let's move on to the seventh word in our lesson, spurred. Spurred is a verb. Spurred means to encourage an activity or development or make it happen faster. The article says, spurred worries Washington might accept many Russian demands, but ultimately resulted in more U.S. pressure on Russia. The article stated that Trump's meeting with Putin caused a huge concern that the U.S. would agree to Russia's demand, but in the end, the U.S. placed more pressure on Russia. Let's practice with spurred. The teacher's praise spurred the students to study harder. The rise in fuel prices spurred many people to use public transport. Let's look at the fourth paragraph. The latest U.S. peace proposal, a 28-point plan, caught many in the U.S. government, Kyiv, and Europe off guard and prompted fresh concerns that the Trump administration might be willing to push Ukraine to sign a peace deal heavily tilted toward Moscow. The plan would require Kyiv to cede more territory, accept curbs on military, and bar it from joining NATO, conditions that Kyiv has long rejected as tantamount to surrender. Let's look at the eighth word in our lesson, off guard. Off guard is an adjective. Off guard means to surprise someone by doing something that they are not expecting or ready for. The article says, the latest U.S. peace proposal, a 28-point plan, caught many in the U.S. government, Kyiv, and Europe off guard. The article underlines the fact that many people were surprised by the 28-point U.S. peace plan in the U.S. government, Ukraine, and Europe. Let's practice with off guard. He was completely off guard when his friends threw him a birthday party. She was caught off guard by the sudden announcement of her promotion. Let's look at the 9th word in our lesson, prompted. Prompted is a verb, and it is the past simple for prompt. Prompted means to have caused someone to take action or something to happen. The article says, prompted fresh concerns that the Trump administration might be willing to push Ukraine to sign a peace deal heavily tilted toward Moscow. The article notes that there are growing concerns that the Trump administration might pressure Ukraine into a peace deal that significantly favors Russia. Let's practice with prompted. The rise in prices prompted many people to shop earlier than usual. Holiday sales prompted the store to hire extra staff. Let's move on to the 10th word in our lesson, seed. Seed is a verb. Seed means to give up, surrender, or hand over something, usually power, land, rights, or even control, often by treaty or agreement. The article says the plan would require Kyiv to cede more territory. According to the article, Ukraine would have to give up a lot of its land to Russia. Let's practice with cede. The country ceded territory after losing the war. She refused to cede control of the project. Let's move on to the 11th word in our lesson, curb. Curb is a verb. It means to control, limit, or restrain something. The article says, accept curb on its military and bar it from ever joining NATO. The article indicates that Ukraine, as part of the U.S. plan, would have to accept limits on how big or powerful its military can be, and it will never become a member of NATO. Let's practice with curb. The school is working to curb bullying. The city is trying to curb pollution. Let's move on to the 12th word in our lesson, tantamount. Tantamount is an adjective. Tantamount means the same as or equal to something in effect. The article says, conditions Kyiv has long rejected as tantamount to surrender. The article underscores the reality that the conditions in the U.S. plan for Ukraine have always been rejected by Ukraine, since they are the same as giving up or surrendering. Let's practice with tantamount. Ignoring safety regulations in the factory is tantamount to risking workers' lives. The mayor's refusal to meet with the teachers is tantamount to ignoring their concerns. Now, in this section of reading, listen carefully and repeat what I say. Now, in this section of reading, listen carefully and repeat what I say. U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll held talks with Russian officials in Abu Dhabi on Monday. The latest effort by President Donald Trump's administration to broker a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. The meeting comes after U.S. and Ukrainian officials sought to narrow the gaps between them over a plan to end the war in Ukraine. Agreeing to modify a US proposal that Kyiv and its European allies saw as a Kremlin wish list. US policy toward the war in Ukraine has zigzagged in recent months. Trump's hastily arranged Alaska summit with the Russian President Vladimir Putin in August spurred worries Washington might accept many Russian demands, but ultimately resulted in more US pressure on Russia. The latest US peace proposal, a 28-point plan, caught many in the US government, Kyiv and Europe off guard and prompted fresh concerns that the Trump administration might be willing to push Ukraine to sign a peace deal, heavily tilted toward Moscow. The plan would require Kyiv to cede more territory, accept curb on its military, and bar it from ever joining NATO. Conditions Kyiv has long rejected as tantamount to surrender.